Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Schumacher, and I'm the Vice President of Exhibits and Programs for the Mob Museum. Thank you for tuning in to our virtual series, Writing the Mob, Chronicling Organized Crime in the 20th Century. This is the third of 6 virtual programs we are holding this spring and summer, focused on authors who have written new books about organized crime history. It's a pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's program, Michael Cannell. Michael is a veteran newspaper and magazine reporter and editor who has published several nonfiction books, including Incendiary, The Psychiatrist, The Mad Bomber, and the Invention of Criminal Profiling, The Limit, Life and Death on the 1961 Grand Prix Circuit, and I Am Pei, a Mandarin of Modernism. In his latest book, Michael delves deeply into the history of organized crime. The book is A Brotherhood Betrayed, The Man Behind the Rise and Fall of Murder, Inc., and it chronicles the life of Brooklyn hitman Abe Reles. The Mob Museum's Director of Public Programs, Shakela, will serve as our moderator for today's program. Take it away, Shakela.
Jeff, thank you. And Michael Cannell, thank you again for joining us. We are happy to host you here.
Thank you, Shakela.
So first, just talk to us a little bit about your latest book, as Jeff mentioned, Brotherhood Betrayed, The Man Behind the Rise and Fall of Murder, Inc. What inspired you to write this book first?
Well, you know, people often ask me about writing a book and what it takes to write a book. I think many of them are interested in writing books themselves, or they're just curious about the life of a writer. And they often ask me about how I came to write this book. And what I always say is nobody should write a book unless they're obsessed with the subject. To write a book, you have to be obsessed with the topic. And I had difficulty becoming obsessed with the subject of A Brotherhood Betrayed. It's a big, sprawling story with many colorful characters and many storylines. So it's hard to neatly encapsulate what the story is. But I'll try to do it this way. In the years before World War II, Americans were fixated. They were fixated on newspaper coverage of the war between the mob and the forces of law and order. And one man tipped the balance in that war. His name was Abe Reles. He was also known as Kid Twist. He was a Jewish mobster from Brownsville, Brooklyn. And he was appointed to be the head of an assassination squad known as Murder, Inc. And their job was to kill all the informants. The theory was simple. If there were no informants, there could be no prosecutions. And that theory worked for about a decade. And then Abe Reles abruptly switched teams. The man who had spent his entire adult life killing informants then became the biggest informant of all. So, not surprisingly, Abe Reles died under mysterious circumstances. A lot of people stood to benefit from his death, but it's never been determined who actually killed him. And his death remains one of the underworld's great mysteries. And so that's a long-winded answer to your question. You can see that it's not hard to be obsessed with that story. And so that's when I became aware of this story, it jumped out at me immediately as a book. It felt like a Netflix series, actually. It really felt like it had the architecture and structure of a book.
Just hearing you repeat basically what kind of unfolds in your book, it is quite fascinating to read. So, I want to kind of take it back a little bit and let's talk about how the mob kind of transformed over the years. So we have the first generation of mobsters who they come from Sicily and Naples, and they're they pretty much, keep to themselves. How did that change over time? What happened?
Right. I mean, that's exactly right, Shakayla. That first generation, they called them the Mustache Petes, as you may know. They were the old guys who came from Naples and Sicily, and they didn't come to America, by the way, because they wanted to be Americans. The American dream was not part of their agenda. They came mostly because they were escaping prosecution in Italy. And at that time, there was no extradition treaty. So if they came to America, they were safe. Once they got here, they didn't show much interest in being Americans. I mean, as I say in the book, they didn't care about drinking beer and watching baseball. They wanted to stay Sicilian and stay Neapolitan. And in fact, they did. They really hunkered down in their neighborhoods, many of them in Lower Manhattan. And they carried on just as they did in the old world. And the way they carried on was very much about the vendettas and vengeance and, petty rivalries. And when the next generation came along, the generation of Bugsy Siegel, the generation of Lucky Luciano, they were born in America and they had a very different orientation. They wanted to run the mob like an American corporation. They wanted to run it for profit, and they wanted to run it without regard for ethnic boundaries. And that was a very important point. So what happened is that Lucky Luciano decided that they were going to try to transition to this new idea of what the mob could be. And that meant killing off the Mustache Petes, and they did. And then Lucky Luciano and his generation were in charge, and they welcomed, the Italian mobsters welcomed working with the Jewish mob, to a lesser extent the Irish mob and the African American mob, but they formed a kind of consortium, and it was really a coast to coast confederacy of mobs, and their idea was to run the mob. I think Lucky Luciano actually said he wanted to run the mob like General Motors, and that's what they set out to do in the 1930s.
And so, as you just described, we know that organized crime, it became much more widespread and dangerous over time. So let's bring back Mr. Abe Reles here. What role did he play in all of this? How did he help to make organized crime this nationwide enterprise in a way?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an unlikely and interesting thing. Lucky Luciano, Bugsy Siegel, these flashy and even glamorous characters that had taken over the mob. They were sort of big figures in popular culture at the time. I mean, movies were based on them. But what they needed was, part of their idea about organization was that they needed an assassination squad. And their idea was, as I said earlier, if there could be no prosecutions, then there could be, if there could be no informants, then there could be no prosecutions. And so they very systematically set up an assassination squad to eliminate informants all across the country. And they chose Abe Reles to run that organization. He called it the Combination because it was half Jewish, half Italian, but a newspaper reporter started calling it Murder Incorporated, and that's the name that stuck.
And so what a way to grab the audience's attention. On the first page, we find out that Abe Reles dies on the very first page, but we don't know how. And so I wanted to ask you, were you hesitant to write the book that way?
That's a really good question, Shakela. Yes, I was. I mean, I'm giving things. I'm giving the ending away at the beginning, right? So my instinct, for better or worse, was to let the reader know, to signal to the reader what was going to happen, and in hopes that the reader would stay with me from point A to point B. I think readers want to know how a story ends, but what I really think they care about is more than the ending is the journey to the ending. So that was my theory, and I don't know if I was right or not, but I'll let you be the judge of that.
Well, I think you were right. This murder mystery kind of follows us throughout the entire book. And so what are some of the theories surrounding Reles's death that you know of?
Right. So just to back up for a second, Abe Reles was the head of Murder Inc., and then he very abruptly turned himself over to the Brooklyn district attorney, and he became the biggest informant in mob history. He told the district attorneys about literally hundreds of murders, and he was being held in a kind of limbo in a hotel in Coney Island, along with some other informants. The reason I say limbo is because they were not prisoners exactly, but they were not free either. They were being held under layers of police guard. The police and the district attorneys were acutely aware that the mob was going to try to kill Abe Reles before he could testify against the big bosses. And then one morning he went out the window of his hotel room and was found lying dead on the roof of a kitchen annex. So the police concluded that he was trying to escape. It's possible that he was trying to escape. He had squirreled away $60,000, I believe was the figure, of mob money, and it's possible that he was trying to deliver it to his family. He may have concluded that he was going to die. He had reasons to believe that he might be dying of cancer. Most people would say he would not have tried to escape. Most people, or many people, would say that the last thing he wanted to do was to be outside of that building. He did not want to be, because the mob was going to, if he was in the wild, the mob was going to get him. So if he wasn't trying to escape, then who actually did? How did he actually die? The most obvious answer is that the mob killed him. There are reasons to believe that they paid off the police to look the other way. It's possible that the police themselves killed him. Now, the police had their own reasons to kill him, because Abe Reles not only knew a lot about mob murders, he also knew about all of the police and city officials who were taking bribes. So the police themselves would benefit from him dying, arguably would have benefited from him dying as well. And here's the sort of the clincher here is that William O'Dwyer was then the district attorney of Brooklyn. He was later mayor. Now, when he was mayor, some questions began to come up about Abe Reles's death and whether he, in fact, might be connected to Abe Reles's death. And at that point, he resigned as mayor very abruptly and became ambassador to Mexico. The timing is, the one thing I will say is the timing is suspicious, right?
Why do you think Reles isn't as well known as some of the other infamous mobsters, like, let's say, as you mentioned, Lucky Luciano?
Shaquille, I'm going to answer that question, but while I'm answering it, we do have a slideshow. Should we play that and so people can just see some of the images associated with that story? Yeah, I mean, the Abe Reles is not a household name the way some of these other, the way Lucky Luciano is, for example. And I think that that's in part because he was really a kid from he was from Brownsville, Brooklyn, as I mentioned. He was a neighborhood kid, and you know, while Lucky Luciano was living in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, Abe Reles was living with his in-laws in Brooklyn. It was a very different setup. He was not making the same money as the big mob lords, and he wasn't, you know, rolling into prohibition nightclubs the way they were. He was still living as if he was just like, you know, a gas station attendant or a handyman back in Brooklyn. One of the really the books that I really liked about the mob that was written at that time was about the Jewish mob, and it was called "But He Was Nice to His Mother" was the title of the book, which, you know, seems to suggest that for some of these Jewish mobsters in Brooklyn, they were just sort of nice neighborhood kids who happened to also, by the way, be mobsters.
And so there are quite a few characters in this book with some pretty big personalities. Who were the most interesting to learn and write about here?
Yeah, I mean, it was just ridiculous when I was researching this book. There was one big personality after the next, and I kind of didn't know what to do with them all. It was like it was like a party full of big personalities. Yeah, I would say if I had to pick a favorite character, it would be a man named Big Gangy Cohen, who was a Murder Inc. gunman, and as was often the case, was called upon to kill his best friend. And that is because the best friend might not get in the car with somebody he doesn't know, but he won't be suspicious if his best friend tells him to get in the car. Big Gangy Cohen was involved in killing his best friend, Walter Sage. He was part of a couple of men who ice picked Walter Sage to death. And as soon as they had done that on a little country road in upstate New York, Gangy Cohen had the idea that he might be next. And so he bolted. He took off into the woods, and nobody saw him again for a couple of years, until one night, two of the Murder Inc. guys went to a movie, a kind of cheesy second-rate movie about a boxer at the local movie palace. And in the movie, they see Gangy Cohen. So it turned out that Gangy Cohen had gone to Hollywood and changed his name and had an entirely a second career playing small parts in movies. So he was later brought back east, tried and acquitted, and returned to Hollywood and had a long career had a small part in the TV show Bonanza.
So interesting. And I want to talk a little bit more about Murder Inc. too. So I assume that they wanted people to be fearful of them because these killings that were described, they were so violent and they were so elaborate too. So kind of describe to listeners how exactly this operation worked, how they pulled this off for as long as they did.
Yeah, well, the way they worked it off was very businesslike. Abe Reles and his cronies sat in the back of a candy store in Brooklyn. We think of candy store now. It meant something different then. Candy store was more like a coffee shop, a place where people hung out. So they had this booth in the back of a candy shop, and the phone would ring, and it would be a phone call to them, and they would learn that a mob boss in Cleveland or in Los Angeles or in Miami wanted one of his men to be eliminated, that he was suspected of being disloyal or being an informant. And so Abe Reles, or more often one of his men, would pack a bag just like a middle management businessman going on a business trip. And he would pack a bag with a change of clothes, but also a gun, a meat cleaver, a rope. And they would fly to that city. The local mob would take him and show him this person so that the assassin could see the target. And the assassin would do his job and then immediately get back on a plane and fly back to New York. Often would not know who the person was or what offense they had committed, and would really only know the background when they read the newspaper the next day. The murders, as you say, were gruesome, and for the purposes of Murder Inc., the more gruesome, the better, because it wasn't just about eliminating that person. It was also about sending a message to anybody who might contemplate turning state's evidence. So it was a murder, but it was also almost like a theatrical performance meant for kind of maximum effect.
So I'm just trying to wrap my head around all of this. So you could just call a number, order a hit, and that was it.
Well, the way it worked is that Lucky Luciano had set up, as we said earlier, this confederacy of mobs around the country. So there was a gang in Detroit called the Purple Gang. And if the Purple Gang suspected that somebody was disloyal, they would call one of the mob bosses in New York. It could be, most likely it would be Albert Anastasia or Lepke Buchalter. They were essentially Abe Reles' bosses. They would be the ones who would be relaying this order to the candy store. And so that's the way it worked. Again, they really wanted to run it like a corporation, and they were very organized about it.
In a candy store at that.
A candy store, and there was a little old lady who was selling candy to kids in the front of the candy store. And oh, by the way, she was also a gangster on the side.
How old was this little old lady?
Well, I say she was an little old lady, but I think she was probably about my age. I think she was like in her mid-60s.
So I mean, this must have been their worst nightmare, when Reles decides to turn against them. So how did law enforcement convince Reles to become a government informant for them?
Yeah, it's very interesting. What happened is that the district attorney's office and the police were constantly pulling these guys in and putting them in jail, really throughout Reles' entire life. I mean, from his teenage years on, the police were just harassing him and bringing him in, and they would bring them in on what they called vagrancy charges. And then usually what happened is that the gangsters would spend the night in jail, and then they would just laugh, and they would pull a thick wad of bills out of their pocket and pay their bail and walk out. So when Abe Reles was brought in on sort of flimsy murder charges with two other men, he didn't take it very seriously. But what the district attorney did something very shrewd. This is William O'Dwyer. He put the men in separate jails in separate boroughs of New York, separate neighborhoods of New York, so that it would be really impossible for them to communicate with each other. And then they really went to work on these men and made them paranoid. And they convinced them that their friends were now cooperating with the police, and that they would be the ones left holding the bag. It was like musical chairs. They didn't want to be left out. So Abe Reles, as I mentioned earlier, believed that he had cancer. For some time, he had been spitting up blood. It turned out it was not cancer, but he thought he had cancer, and he felt that one way or another he would probably die. The witness protection program didn't exist at this time, but at this point he figured that the game was over, and that if his friends implicated him, he would probably go to the electric chair. So he figured better to make a deal and protect his family than to tough it out. And so he came into the district attorney's office late at night. And what law enforcement had not, I think, quite realized is that Abe Reles knew about hundreds of murders. I mean, by one account, 1,000 murders. I find that hard to believe, but certainly hundreds of murders. And that he surprised them because he did not have the appearance of somebody who would have a great grasp of details. But he had an unbelievable encyclopedic memory. And he could remember exact dates and locations for murders. And he poured all of this out day after day in the district attorney's office. And so the district attorneys, they basically knew that if they could keep Abe Reles alive, that they would be able to send dozens of top mobsters, not just to jail, but to the electric chair, if they could keep Abe Reles alive.
And so that, of course, was the issue, if they were able to keep Reles alive long enough to, maybe testify against some of these bigger mobsters. And, we know that he dies before that, but you said he helped to clear hundreds of murders, which means he was in the know, he was connected.
Oh yeah, he knew. I mean, he was basically the dispatcher for these murders. He was personally involved in some of them, but he certainly knew the details of really of all of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, another name, Bugsy Siegel. So he was on trial for murder, and Reles was slated to testify against him before he died. And you have to think Las Vegas would have looked pretty different if that was the case, right?
Yes. So it's so interesting that when William O'Dwyer convinced Abe Reles to switch teams and to cooperate with law enforcement, William O'Dwyer was going to use Abe Reles in Brooklyn to testify against a good number of mobsters. But he was also going to loan Abe Reles out to prosecutors around the country, including prosecutors in Los Angeles. And in fact, I forget now, I think on 2 occasions, Abe Reles flew to Los Angeles, and I guess you would call it a deposition. He spent a couple of days with a district attorney in Los Angeles in preparation for testifying against Bugsy Siegel. When Abe Reles died, one of the main beneficiaries was Bugsy Siegel, and of course, if Reles had testified against Bugsy Siegel, he very likely would have gone to jail or the electric chair, and there may have still been a Las Vegas, but it wouldn't have unfolded the way it did.
Do you know of any other mob bosses who he was supposed to testify against that maybe got off?
Yeah, the morning that Abe Reles died, he was supposed to testify against Lepke Buchhalter, who is, not so much of a household name, but he was an extremely important figure in New York at that time. When Reles died, everybody thought, well, I guess Lepke Buchholzer is going to get off. In fact, he didn't. He went to the electric chair. He died at the electric chair. He was the one mob boss that did go to the electric chair. But many others survived because Abe Reles died. Most notably, Albert Anastasia, who had been a fugitive. Interestingly, his way of hiding from law enforcement was to join the army. And then when Reles went out the window and died, it was safe for Anastasia to come out of hiding.
What led to Lepke's conviction and ultimately his death too, the death penalty?
Well, I mean, initially people said he could not be convicted without Abe Reles. That wasn't exactly true. There were other informants that were being housed in the hotel in Coney Island. It kind of pinch hit for Reles. So there were a good number of charges against Buchholter, both state and federal charges. He had been a fugitive and, in fact, gave himself up directly to J. Edgar Hoover in a deal that was brokered by Walter Winchell, who was a gossip columnist, really the big gossip columnist of the time. And Buchholter thought that he was making a deal and was just going to get substantial jail time. But that I think just about shortly after he turned himself in, he realized there was going to be no deal. He was going to the electric chair.
How did Reles's death impact national law enforcement and the politics in New York too?
Wow, what a question, Shakela. I wish I had a great answer for that. I mean, I guess what comes to mind is that it propelled William O'Dwyer it allowed him to become mayor. So kind of what emerges out of that was that William O'Dwyer, like many other prosecutors, like Thomas Dewey, who plays a big role in this book, saw the crusade against the mob as a ticket to political advancement. And it also brings to mind Rudy Giuliani, who did the same decades later. So what it did is it allowed William O'Dwyer to become mayor, but he wasn't mayor long, as we mentioned earlier. In 1951, a Senate committee traveled around the country having hearings on the mob and corruption, and William O'Dwyer flew up from Mexico to New York to be questioned by this committee, and he did not come off very well. There were a lot of questions about the death of Abe Reles.
I want to spend a few minutes to talk about Thomas Dewey. He's, featured in our museum here in Las Vegas. So kind of explain to viewers the real impact that he had on the future of organized crime in this country after Reles.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to understand the significance of Thomas Dewey it's important to understand the extent to which the mob controlled municipalities in the 1930s. Before Prohibition, the mob didn't really exist as we know it. The mob existed as really local gangs, sort of neighborhood menaces that were holding people up and robbing stores and threatening people and, engaging in kind of low-level racketeering. But Prohibition allowed the mob to do two things. One, to make huge amounts of money. And number two, to become organized. In order to run speakeasies or to smuggle liquor, it required a network. And so all of a sudden, these local hoodlums were working with each other, and they were paying off the cops because they could now afford to do that. And so this infrastructure developed, and they made so much money that they paid off not only the police, but eventually they were paying off judges, even district attorneys. So the mob really controlled New York and many other cities in a way that's hard for us to really imagine now. And in the early 30s, Thomas Dewey, an amazingly young man, I think he was 30, in his mid-30s, I believe, when he was appointed as special prosecutor to bust the mob. The press called him the baby prosecutor. He was only 10 years out of law school, and nobody gave him much of a chance. But Dewey was really effective. I mean, he was really like a force of nature. And he didn't entirely see the job through because he went on to do other things. He later ran for president and was governor of New York. But he, in a way, kind of set the precedent for the ways in which law enforcement could bust the mob.
Definitely. Thank you, Michael. And we have quite a few questions from some of those watching online, and I want to give you a few minutes to get through some of these. So the first question was, what was the larger hierarchy overseeing Murder, Inc.? Can you talk a little bit about Albert, Anastasia, and Lepke? How did they fit into it?
Right. So we talked about how Lucky Luciano really spearheaded this overthrow of the mustache Petes and ushered in a new Americanized generation of mobsters. And when Lucky Luciano staged essentially a coup, everybody assumed that he was going to declare himself the boss of bosses, as they called him in those days. And he didn't. He set up essentially a board of directors that would run the mob nationally. And Lepke Buchalter and Albert Anastasia were part of that. But so were the major mob figures from other cities. So again, a board of directors, just as a corporation, would run things. And they, what comes to mind are these scenes in a movie like The Godfather, where the various bosses get together and sit around a table and have a big meal and hash out their differences. The board of directors really kind of operated like a kangaroo court, and they would decide if changes needed to be made, if people needed to be eliminated. They kind of hash that out, and that was the structure.
Murray's Latin from Facebook asked, can you talk about the Goldust Brothers?
The Goldust Brothers. I'm sorry. That name doesn't ring a bell.
Well, Murray, if you're listening to us, if you can explain a little bit more, and we'll make sure to answer your question. Another person asked, how much money would a Murder Inc. hitman typically make for killing someone?
Yeah, what a good question. Some of these guys, most of these guys were on a retainer. And offhand, I can't quite remember what the retainer was. If you were on a retainer, you were paid like a monthly stipend, and then you would be paid a little extra for each murder. But some of these, what I want to say is that some of these, the kind of hangers on that were brought in to help with murders, were paid almost nothing. I mean, in the case that I described where Gangi Cohen killed his best friend, Walter Sage, a young man whose name was Pretty Levine was brought in to help. And I forget the sum that he was given, but he later told the district attorney that by the time he had paid for his hotel in upstate New York and paid for gas, I think he said he literally had like $1 left as his payment. So they were not paid much. It's sort of that the nature of the mob, at least at that time, is that they were making huge amounts of money, but 90% of that money was going into the pockets of the top figures in the mob.
Well, then you have to think, why did they do it if they, were pretty much getting sense?
Well, somebody like Abe Reles was doing it because he had a lot of other things going on the side. He had gambling operations, he had prostitution operations, he had all sorts of racketeering, and this was sort of his connection to the big bosses. He needed to stay in good stead, in good favor with the big bosses. He was not going to say no to the big bosses. In some cases, they did it simply because they were trapped. Pretty Levine, for example, would love to have gotten out. He tried at one point to get out. They were not going to allow him to get out. And one of the ways that they trapped people like Pretty Levine is that they loaned the money at loan shark rates. And it was almost impossible for them to pay it back. Just the interest was just ridiculous. And so the one way they could pay it back was by working for them. So that they were forgiven some of their debt if they did these jobs.
Gotcha. Kelly from Facebook asked, what resources did you find to be the most helpful in discovering the details you needed for your story? Also, did you run into any dead ends? And if so, how did you handle those in your writing?
Well, to answer the first part, I really relied enormously on newspaper articles at the time. I mean, I have been a reporter my whole life. I really believe in the act of interviewing people. I think it's really important to writing, to interview people, to hear their voices, to hear them tell the stories. I think it somehow enlivens the writing. But in this case, I just couldn't do that. I mean, this is the first project I've ever done where I really didn't interview anybody. And I was really worried about that because what I didn't want to do was just rewrite, research. I didn't want to write like a big Wikipedia entry. But fortunately for me, the newspapers of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s were full, particularly the local newspapers. And in those days, there were so many newspapers that each neighborhood in Brooklyn had their own newspaper. Fortunately, all those newspapers had, they were full of very, very rich details and really colorful quotes. The other resource that I will mention is that in 1940, New York City photographed every single business and residence and for tax purposes. And all of those photos are online. And so, it sounds funny, but it actually made a big difference to me to be able to actually see these places. just to see what they look like at that time. Can't think of any real dead ends that I came up against, except that I would say the question about Abe Reles' death is sort of the ultimate dead end. I mean, I've seen all the forensics on his death, but beyond that, there's really no evidence that would lead me to come up with my own conclusion about who killed him.
And I believe this one is from Murray about the Goldust brothers. He said Morris and William Goldust were business partners of Lepke, and they were charged with the murder of a Teamsters official. Have you heard anything about that?
You know, I probably have information on that. I probably do. There were a million characters like that. I can't, to be honest, I just can't recall the Goldust brothers.
And another person said the other government witness was Ali TikTok Tannenbaum, right?
Right, that's correct. Right.
What can you tell us about him?
TikTok Tannenbaum was nicknamed TikTok because he talked so fast and talked so much. He was a character who, when things started to fall apart, fled to Florida. He came back to New York. The district attorneys grabbed him, I believe, in Brighton Beach, sort of near Coney Island, and he decided to join Reles and become an informant. And he was housed in that hotel, the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island. So he was somebody. TikTok Tannenbaum was somebody who was a sort of medium to minor player in these operations, but would have participated in any number of murders.
Thank you, Michael. And I had mentioned before just how fascinating of a story this all was, from really the beginning to the end. When you were writing the book or when you were doing your research, were you surprised at all of the information that you were able to gather, or did you know that you had something good there?
Yeah, I mean, it just really, as I was working on it, I just kind of couldn't believe it. Pretty Levine and TikTok Tannenbaum and Big Gangy Cohen. These were not really likable people, but to somebody writing a book, it felt like a gift from heaven to have these characters land in my lap. I mean, they were just too good to be true. They were so colorful. They were really like just straight out of movies or almost cartoon characters. And I was concerned about how many characters readers would have an appetite for. There were so many people like TikTok Tannenbaum. How many could I put in the book? I was concerned about that. And I was also concerned about people appearing and then disappearing and reappearing 150 pages later. So for me, that was really tricky, was trying to, it was like trying to direct an opera with, a cast of 200. How do you get people on stage and then off stage and then back on stage again?
And of course, you had a lot to work with this book. Was there anything that you left out that maybe you regret now, or something that was interesting that you found throughout your research that really grabbed your eye too?
Yeah, there is one thing. I mean, the thing, Shakayla, that comes to mind is that when Thomas Dewey originally tried to prosecute the mob, his way in was through prostitution. And he he figured that if he could round up the prostitutes who were working in brothels controlled by the mob, that he could get some of them to talk. And that's what he did. They were afraid for their lives for very good reasons. But some of them did talk. And that was sort of the very beginning of the end for the mob at that time. And I did include some of those prostitutes in the book, particularly Cokie Flo, a woman named Cokie Flo, whose mugshot we saw very briefly in the slideshow. But I wish that I regret not telling their stories more fully, because their stories were really rich and, as you can imagine, heartbreaking. These were women who were trapped in a horrible situation. Many of them became drug addicts, and they're often the girlfriends of mobsters who were just sort of abandoned into these brothels. And I didn't include very much information about that, but I wish I had.
Another person asked if the Half Moon Hotel is still standing.
It is not. I wish it was. The background on the Half Moon Hotel, for anybody who cares, is that at the west, I guess the west end of Coney Island, there was an idea that Coney Island would become a sort of a more upscale, respectable summer resort along the lines of the Jersey Shore at that time. And the Half Moon Hotel was a rather elaborate and kind of gaudy hotel built in an effort to draw a more affluent crowd. Coney Island was, of course, it was sort of like the riffraff was down the beach, and the Half Moon Hotel was meant to be the kind of the fancy spot in Coney Island. The reason that the district attorneys were keeping the informants at the Half Moon Hotel was that it had never really succeeded as a hotel and was mostly empty. And for that reason, the district attorneys were able to rent out suites of rooms. And it was, it still existed as a structure up until, gosh, I don't know, maybe the 1980s. At one point, it was used as a medical facility of some kind, but was eventually demolished.
Thank you. Another person just very quickly had said some really wild nicknames within Murder Inc. We had TikTok Tannenbaum. Abe Reles was called Kid Twist. What other ones did you come by?
Oh God, there were endless nicknames. I mean, there was a guy named Charlie Spinach. And why did they have these nicknames? I mean, I've always wondered that. I think it's almost like it's like a fraternity thing. It's like a college fraternity. To be sort of like bonded as brothers, they have to kind of give up their normal names and have these nicknames. Reles's lieutenants, his immediate lieutenants, one of them was named Pittsburgh Phil. By the way, he had never been to Pittsburgh. One of them was named Bugsy Goldstein. One of them was named Happy because he was forever morose and in a bad mood. The nicknames they're just ridiculous.
Michael, thank you. And I want to give you just a few minutes to talk about what's next for you. What are you planning right now?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't set out in life to be a mafia writer, but I seem to be doing that now. I'm working on a book about the mob in New York in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. It's sort of, in a way, I hadn't really thought of this before, but in a way, it's the sort of bookend to to this story. If the mob as we know it began with Lucky Luciano and Murder Inc. in the 1930s, then it really ended in the early 90s when Rudy Giuliani used the RICO laws to put John Gotti and others into jail.
Well, thank you, Michael. We are excited to read it and welcome you to the museum when it's over. And I want to say thank you to all of those joining us online too for this special presentation. We appreciate all of the comments and the back and forth that we were able to have this afternoon. And Michael, thank you again for joining us for this hour of Writing the Mob, chronicling organized crime in the 20th century.
Thank you so much, Shigelle.